The evening air was thick with the scent of jasmine and wet grass. Daniel pressed his thumb against the hose nozzle, sending a gentle arc of water over the petunias lining the front walkway. The droplets caught the last rays of sunlight, creating tiny rainbows that disappeared as quickly as they formed. He watched them with the detached attention of a man who had performed this ritual 1,000 times before. The neighborhood was quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. The kind of silence that settles over suburban streets when everyone has retreated behind their carefully maintained facades, when the illusion of perfection becomes its own kind of prison. Daniel had lived in this house for 7 years now, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still waiting for something to begin. Real life, purpose, meaning. Something beyond the endless cycle of work, watering the garden and waking up to do it all again. He moved to the roses near the porch, their crimson petals already closing against the approaching dusk. His movements were mechanical, efficient, the kind of practiced routine that requires no thought. And that was the problem, wasn't it? No thought. No challenge, no risk, just the comfortable numbness of predictability, day after day, year after year. The doubts had been growing louder lately, in the shower, during his commute, in the dead space between sleep and waking. What am I doing? What have I done with my life? The questions gnawed at him with increasing persistence, though he had become skilled at pushing them down, drowning them in routine and distraction. As he bent to adjust the spray pattern on the hose, a sound cut through the suburban silence. Footsteps, rapid, uneven footsteps on the sidewalk. Daniel straightened, turning toward the noise with mild curiosity, a break in the monotony at least. The man who emerged from the shadows of the neighbor's oak tree looked like he'd been through hell. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to his thin frame. His hair was plastered to his skull, water dripping from his chin, his nose, the tips of his fingers. But it wasn't rain that had drenched him. The sky was clear, the evening dry. Which meant what? A river? A pool? Had he run through someone's sprinklers in a panic? The stranger's eyes locked onto Daniel's with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine, despite the warm evening. There was something wild in that gaze, something desperate and urgent, and completely at odds with the manicured lawns and matching mailboxes that defined this street. Before Daniel could speak, before he could even process what he was seeing, the stranger was at his gate. His hand gripped the white picket fence with such force that his knuckles went bone-white. His chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath, each inhalation ragged and painful. Daniel took an instinctive step backward, his grip tightening on the hose. Water continued to spray onto the grass at his feet, creating a small puddle that began to spread toward his shoes. His heart had begun to race, that primal warning system kicking in, telling him something was wrong, very wrong. The stranger opened his mouth to speak, but at first only a strangled sound emerged. He swallowed hard, tried again. When the words finally came, they were barely above a whisper, yet they carried across the space between them with perfect clarity. I need to talk to you about the Antichrist. Daniel's hand went slack. The hose fell from his grip, writhing on the ground like a serpent, water spraying wildly across the walkway. He stared at the man, waiting for the punchline, the camera crew, some indication that this was a prank. But the stranger's expression remained fixed, deadly serious. I know who he is, the man continued, his voice gaining strength, rising with a fervor that bordered on fanaticism. I know his identity, and you're connected to this. You're part of it, whether you know it or not. You have to be. Daniel felt his throat tighten. This was insane. This was a lunatic, clearly suffering from some kind of psychotic break. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to go inside, lock the door, call the police. But something else held him in place, curiosity. That same emptiness that had been eating at him suddenly presented with anything that broke the pattern. I think you should leave, Daniel heard himself say, though his voice sounded distant, uncertain even to his own ears. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know you. You need to go." The stranger's face crumpled, desperation flooding his features. He pressed against the gate, and for a moment Daniel thought he might try to climb it. "Please, please, you have to listen. I've been looking for you. I've seen things, terrible things, and they all point to you. Not as the evil, but as someone who can stop it, or maybe start it. I don't know anymore, but I know you're important. I know this is real." Daniel's hand was already on his phone in his pocket, thumb hovering over the emergency call button. But he didn't press it. Not yet. The stranger's words were absurd, the ravings of a madman, and yet there was something in his eyes that wasn't quite insanity. Conviction, maybe. Or truth. The kind of terrible truth that destroys the person who discovers it. "I'm going inside now," Daniel said, his voice firmer this time. He turned toward his front door, picking his way around the writhing hose, water soaking into his shoes. His hand found the door handle, cool metal, real, solid, safe. Behind him the stranger let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "You don't understand. None of us have time. He's already moving. The signs are everywhere. And if you turn away now, if you ignore this, everything that happens next will be on both of us." Daniel pushed the door open, stepped into his house. The familiar scent of his home, that mixture of coffee and old books, and the faint, lingering smell of this morning's toast enveloped him. Normal, safe, sane. He slammed the door shut behind him, turned the lock with shaking hands. Inside, the house was dimly lit, shadows gathering in the corners of his living room. Daniel leaned against the door, his breath coming fast, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the decorative glass panel beside the door, he could see the stranger's silhouette still standing at the gate, motionless now, like a statue of despair. Daniel forced himself to move, to walk into the living room, to put distance between himself and that door. But with each step, the stranger's words echoed in his mind. The Antichrist. A connection. A choice. As if his predictable, meaningless life could somehow be tangled up in something cosmic and terrible. He sank onto his couch, his legs suddenly weak. His living room looked the same as it always did. The bookshelf he'd been meaning to reorganize for months, the coffee table with its collection of unread magazines, the television dark and silent. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was normal. Except it wasn't. Not anymore. Because doubt had a new shape now, a new voice. What if the stranger was telling the truth? Not about the Antichrist, maybe, but about something. What if there was more to life than this comfortable prison he'd built for himself? What if this moment, this bizarre, terrifying moment, was the break in the pattern he'd been unconsciously waiting for? Daniel stood, began to pace. 3 steps to the window. Turn. 3 steps back. His mind raced, trying to apply logic to the illogical, reason to the unreasonable. The stranger was obviously disturbed, possibly dangerous. The smart thing, the sane thing, would be to call the police and let them handle it. Let someone else deal with the crazy man with his apocalyptic delusions. But that word hung in his mind like a weight. But what if? The eternal questions that plague every human who has ever stood at the edge of something unknown. What if this is real? What if I'm supposed to pay attention? What if walking away is the mistake, not the solution? He moved to the window, pulled the curtain aside just enough to peer out. The stranger was still there, sitting now on the curb across the street, his head in his hands, defeated, alone. And in that moment Daniel saw himself. A different kind of defeat, maybe, a quieter kind of despair, but the same fundamental loneliness, the same sense of being adrift in a world that made no sense. His hand was on the doorknob before he'd consciously made the decision. The cool metal against his palm felt like a threshold, a point of no return. On this side of the door was everything he knew: safety, Routine, the slow, comfortable dying of a life unlived. On the other side was chaos, madness maybe, danger certainly, but also possibility. Daniel turned the lock. The click seemed impossibly loud in the silence of his house. He took a breath, steadying himself, though his hands continued to shake. This was insane. This was probably the single stupidest thing he'd ever done. But the alternative, going back to his couch, to his routine, to the endless numb march of identical days, suddenly felt like death itself. He opened the door. The stranger's head snapped up, hope and fear warring in his expression. Daniel stepped out onto his porch, the evening air cool against his skin, carrying with it the scent of water and grass and something else, something electric, like the air before a storm. "Come inside," Daniel heard himself say, his voice steady despite everything. "Tell me everything. But if this is some kind of con, if you're here to rob me or hurt me, I need you to know I have a phone in my pocket and my finger on the dial." The stranger rose slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might shatter this fragile moment of grace. Tears had carved clean tracks down his dirty, wet face. He nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quietly. "I'm here because I'm out of options, because you're the last thread I have left to pull. Because if I'm right about this, we're all in danger, and if I'm wrong, well then I've lost my mind, and at least I'll know for sure." Daniel held the door open, stepping aside to let the stranger pass. As the man crossed the threshold, bringing with him the smell of river water and desperation, Daniel felt something shift inside himself. The doubt that had been eating at him for years crystallized into something sharper, more focused. Not certainty, not yet, but commitment to finding out, to taking the risk, to crossing his own threshold into whatever lay beyond. The door closed behind them with a soft click, sealing them both inside. Outside, the neighborhood remained quiet, oblivious, each house a perfect little box of carefully maintained ignorance. But inside Daniel's home, something had begun that could not be stopped or taken back. A story had found its narrator. A journey had found its travelers. And whatever happened next, Daniel knew with absolute clarity his life would never be predictable again. The first 3 days after the stranger left were the hardest. Not because of what Daniel had learned, but because of what he hadn't. The man, who'd finally introduced himself as Marcus, had given him fragments, pieces of a puzzle so vast and terrifying that Daniel's mind kept rejecting it, insisting it had to be fiction, delusion, anything but truth. But Marcus had left him with names, dates, locations, and a challenge that Daniel couldn't ignore. Verify it yourself. So that's what Daniel did. He started small, with the internet, typing keywords into search engines at 3 in the morning when sleep refused to come. The first name Marcus had given him belonged to a diplomat who died in a car accident 6 months ago in Brussels. Official reports called it mechanical failure. Marcus had called it an assassination. The second name was a tech billionaire who'd abruptly retired from public life, citing health reasons. Marcus claimed the man had seen something he shouldn't have, something that had broken him. Daniel found the obituary, found the retirement announcement, both exactly where Marcus said they'd be. But that proved nothing. Public information. Anyone could find it. Anyone could weave a conspiracy theory from publicly available facts. Except Marcus had also given him something that wasn't public. A photograph pulled from his soaked jacket pocket that first night, wrinkled and water-damaged, but still legible. It showed a meeting that, according to Marcus, had never officially happened. 3 men in a room with no windows. Daniel had stared at that photograph for hours, memorizing every detail, the furniture, the lighting, the expressions on those faces. He'd reverse image searched it. Nothing. He'd run it through every verification tool he could find. No matches. which meant either it was genuine or Marcus was skilled enough with photo manipulation to fool commercial software. Daniel didn't know which possibility frightened him more. By the fourth day, Daniel's carefully ordered life had begun to crack. He called in sick to work, something he never did. He stopped answering his phone when friends called to check on him. He lived on coffee and the kind of single-minded obsession that bypasses hunger entirely. His dining table had transformed into a command center, covered with printouts, scribbled notes, maps marked with locations Marcus had mentioned. His friend Sarah was the first to notice. She showed up unannounced on day 5, letting herself in with the spare key he'd given her years ago, back when their relationship had almost become something more, before they'd both decided friendship was safer. She stood in his doorway, taking in the chaos of his living room with undisguised alarm. Daniel looked up from his laptop, surprised to see daylight streaming through his windows. When had it become afternoon? "Daniel, what the hell is going on?" Sarah's voice carried that particular tone of concern that made him feel like a child caught doing something dangerous. She moved into the room, her eyes scanning the papers scattered across every surface. "I've been calling you for 3 days. You look terrible." He did look terrible. He'd caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror that morning, barely recognizing the hollow-eyed man staring back. When had he last showered, shaved? The stubble on his jaw was approaching beard territory. "I'm investigating something," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He cleared his throat, tried again. "Someone came to me with information. I'm just checking it out." Sarah picked up one of his papers, a timeline he'd constructed tracking unusual deaths and disappearances over the past 5 years. Her eyebrows rose as she read. "This looks like conspiracy theory territory, Daniel. This looks like you've gone down a very dark rabbit hole." "Maybe," he admitted, "but what if it's not? What if there's something real here?" She set the paper down carefully, as if it might contaminate her. "Then you go to the police. You don't turn yourself into some kind of paranoid detective." She paused, her expression softening. "This isn't like you. You're the most grounded person I know. What happened?" How could he explain? How could he tell her about Marcus, about the Antichrist, about the feeling that had been growing in him since that night that his entire life had been a holding pattern, waiting for something real to begin? She'd think he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. "I just need to follow this through," he said finally. "I need to know if it's real." Sarah studied him for a long moment, and he could see the debate playing out behind her eyes. Push harder or back off? "Fine," she said at last. "But I'm staying. At least make sure you eat something. When was the last time you ate?" He couldn't remember. She went to his kitchen, and he heard her rummaging through his sparse supplies, muttering about grown men who lived like college students. Despite everything, he felt a flicker of warmth. Sarah had always been steady, reliable, the counterweight to his tendency toward overthinking. But even as she made him eat, even as she tried to engage him in normal conversation about work and mutual friends and the mundane concerns of regular life, Daniel felt the distance growing between them. She was still living in the world he'd left behind. The world where the biggest concerns were career advancement and mortgage rates and whether to subscribe to another streaming service. He'd crossed into something else, something darker and more urgent, where those concerns felt trivial, like rearranging deck chairs while the ship went down. She left after a few hours, extracting a promise that he'd call her daily, that he wouldn't disappear into his obsession completely. He promised, meaning it in the moment, knowing he'd probably break it. That night, Daniel decided to visit one of the locations Marcus had mentioned, an abandoned church on the outskirts of town, where Marcus claimed meetings took place, gatherings of people who knew the truth, or people who thought they did. Daniel wasn't sure which would be worse. The church loomed against the night sky, its steeple a skeletal finger pointing accusingly at the stars. The windows were dark, some broken, others boarded up. The kind of place teenagers dared each other to enter, where urban explorers took atmospheric photographs for social media. Daniel sat in his car across the street, working up his courage. This was insane. This was how people ended up dead in true crime documentaries. But he'd come this far. He couldn't turn back now without knowing. He crossed the street, his footsteps loud in the silence. The church door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Beyond it, darkness. Complete and total darkness. Daniel pulled out his phone, turned on the flashlight, and stepped inside. The interior smelled of rot and decay, of nature reclaiming what humans had abandoned. His light cut through the darkness, illuminating pews thick with dust, a pulpit that had collapsed to one side, walls marked with graffiti. He moved deeper in, his heart hammering, every shadow a potential threat. And then his light caught something that made his blood freeze. On the wall behind where the altar had once stood, someone had painted a symbol, a complex geometric pattern that seemed to writhe in the shifting light from his phone. Daniel stepped closer, his hand trembling. He knew this symbol. He'd seen it before. Not in Marcus's papers, not in his research. He'd seen it in his own home. The memory hit him like a physical blow. When he'd bought his house 7 years ago, he'd repainted everything. But in the basement, in the corner behind the old water heater where no one would ever look, there had been a mark on the concrete wall. He'd thought it was just damage, water stains maybe, and he'd painted over it without a second thought. But it had been this symbol. He was certain now, seeing it rendered clearly here. The same complex interlocking shapes, the same unsettling geometry that seemed to suggest meanings just beyond comprehension. His phone slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor. The light spun wildly, throwing shadows across the walls like living things. Daniel sank to his knees, his mind reeling. This wasn't possible. He'd bought that house from an elderly couple downsizing to a retirement community. Normal people. There had been nothing strange about the sale, nothing unusual about the home inspection, except for that mark. That symbol he'd painted over and forgotten about until this very moment. Marcus had been right. Whatever this was, Daniel was already part of it. Had been part of it, perhaps, long before Marcus showed up at his door. The connections weren't random. The stranger hadn't chosen him by accident. Daniel's carefully constructed ordinary life had been built on foundations he'd never examined, and now those foundations were crumbling, revealing something ancient and terrible beneath. He grabbed his phone with shaking hands, snapped photographs of the symbol on the church wall. Evidence, proof, though proof of what, he wasn't sure. He needed to talk to Marcus again, needed answers to questions that were multiplying faster than he could formulate them. Daniel stumbled out of the church, gulping the cool night air, feeling like he'd emerged from a tomb. His car seemed impossibly far away across that dark street. He ran, not caring how it looked, not caring about anything except getting away from that symbol and what it represented. He drove home recklessly, his mind racing faster than the car. He'd been marked. Somehow, some way, he'd been selected or tracked or groomed for this, and he'd never known. Every choice he thought he'd made, every decision he'd believed was his own, suddenly suspect. Had he really chosen that house, or had he been guided to it? His home looked different when he pulled into the driveway. No longer a sanctuary, but a crime scene, a place of hidden meanings and buried secrets. He went straight to the basement, not bothering to turn on lights, using his phone to navigate directly to the corner behind the water heater. The paint he'd applied 7 years ago was still intact, clean white latex covering whatever lay beneath. But Daniel could see the outline now, pressing through the paint like bones under skin. The symbol was there, had always been there, waiting. He heard footsteps above him, slow, deliberate footsteps crossing his living room floor. Daniel's hand went to his pocket, to his phone, but before he could dial anything, a voice called down the stairs. "I was hoping you'd figure it out sooner, Marcus." Daniel felt relief and terror in equal measure. He climbed the stairs quickly, emerging into his living room to find the stranger standing by his bookshelf, looking more solid than he had that first desperate night, drier, calmer, almost amused. "How did you get in here?" Daniel demanded, though some part of him already knew the answer. If Marcus had the resources to photograph secret meetings, to track apocalyptic conspiracies, picking a lock was child's play. "I've had a key to this house longer than you have," Marcus said, and that simple statement contained multitudes of implications, none of them comforting. "I'm sorry. I know how this must feel, but you're doing well. Better than I expected, honestly. Most people can't handle the cognitive dissonance. They break." "I'm not broken," Daniel said, though he felt dangerously close to it. "I'm angry, I'm confused, and I want answers, real answers, not fragments and hints." Marcus nodded slowly. "You've earned them. The symbol you found, it's a marker, a way of tracking bloodlines, connections, significance across generations. Your house was owned by 7 different families before you, each one marked. Each one part of a pattern that goes back centuries. A pattern leading to what?" Daniel's voice was barely a whisper now. "To you," Marcus said simply, "and through you, to what comes next. The Antichrist isn't a person who suddenly appears, Daniel. It's a role that's prepared for, cultivated across generations, and the preparation requires certain people in certain places at certain times. You're one of those people. Whether you become an obstacle or a catalyst is still being determined. That's why I came to you, because there's still time to choose." Daniel felt the room spinning. This was too much, too big, too impossible. "I don't believe in prophecies," he said, grasping for rationality, like a drowning man reaching for a rope. "I don't believe in destiny or fate or any of this." "You don't have to believe," Marcus replied. "That's the beautiful horror of it. Whether you believe or not, the wheels are already turning. The question is whether you'll be crushed beneath them or whether you'll help me stop them." "Stop them how?" Daniel heard himself ask, and in asking, knew he'd already made his choice. There was no going back to ignorance, no pretending this wasn't happening. The door had closed behind him, and the only path left was forward into whatever darkness waited. Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Only acknowledgement, only recognition of a fellow traveler who'd just purchased a ticket to hell. "That's the complicated part," Marcus said, "because first we have to find him. And to find him, we have to understand how deep this goes, how many are involved, how much of what we think we know about the world is actually engineered, controlled, directed toward a single purpose." He moved toward Daniel's door, and Daniel realized with a spike of panic that Marcus was leaving. "Wait!" Daniel said, his voice sharp with desperation. "You can't just drop this on me and walk away. You can't leave me with this." Marcus turned back, and in the dim light, Daniel saw something in his eyes he hadn't noticed before. Exhaustion, grief, the kind of profound weariness that comes from carrying impossible knowledge for too long. "I'm not leaving you," Marcus said quietly. "I'm leaving your house. There are people watching now. People who know I've made contact with you. If I stay too long, we both become targets, but I'll be back. 2 days. Prepare yourself. Because what comes next will make everything you've learned so far look simple." And then he was gone, slipping out into the night like he'd never been there at all. Daniel stood alone in his living room, surrounded by his research, his conspiracy theories made flesh, his ordinary life shattered beyond repair. He walked to his window, looked out at his quiet neighborhood. Porch lights glowing warmly, cars in driveways, families inside watching television, arguing about homework, living their simple, uncomplicated lives. Lives Daniel no longer had access to. He'd crossed the threshold, and there was no threshold back. In 2 days, Marcus would return. In 2 days, Daniel would learn more truths he probably didn't want to know. But tonight, this moment, he was suspended between worlds, no longer ordinary, not yet understanding what he'd become. He touched his hand to the window glass, felt its coolness against his palm. Beyond his reflection, beyond the suburban tableau of normalcy, he could feel it now. The presence of something vast and patient and utterly inhuman, watching, waiting, moving pieces on a board so large that human lives were less than pawns. And Daniel, whether he liked it or not, was one of those pieces. The only question left was whether he'd move according to someone else's design, or whether he'd find a way to tip the board entirely. Marcus never came back. 2 days passed, then 3, then a week. Daniel waited, his phone always within reach, jumping at every sound, every notification, every car that slowed in front of his house. But Marcus had vanished as thoroughly as if he'd never existed at all. And that's when the real terror began. Not the terror of what Daniel had learned, but the terror of not knowing if any of it was real. Had Marcus been legitimate? Or had Daniel been the victim of an elaborate con, a psychological operation designed to destabilize him for reasons he couldn't fathom? The line between revelation and delusion had become so thin, he could no longer see it. He'd tried to continue his research, but every lead Marcus had given him suddenly seemed suspect. The photograph of the secret meeting could have been manufactured. The names and dates could have been cherry-picked from public records, given false significance through the power of suggestion. Even the symbol in his basement, the symbol he'd been so certain he'd seen before, now seemed less clear in his memory. Had it really been the same? Or had his mind, desperate for patterns, imposed a connection that didn't exist? Sleep had become impossible. When Daniel closed his eyes, he saw symbols writhing in the darkness, heard voices whispering in languages he didn't understand. When he forced himself to stay awake, the shadows in his house seemed to move with purpose, watching him, judging him, waiting for him to make a mistake that would condemn him. Work had become a casualty. He'd stopped calling in, stopped answering his boss's increasingly frustrated messages. His inbox was full of warnings, then ultimatums, then finally a terse notification that his employment had been terminated effective immediately. He read it with a strange detachment, as if it were happening to someone else. In a way, it was. The Daniel who had cared about job security and performance reviews felt like a different person, someone who died the night Marcus appeared at his door. His friends had started to notice. Not just Sarah, but others, people who'd known him for years, who'd never seen him as anything but stable and reliable, were now exchanging worried glances when they thought he wasn't looking. He could see it in their eyes when they visited, that mix of concern and fear, the way you might look at a beloved dog that had started showing signs of rabies. Sarah was the worst. She came by almost daily now, bringing food he didn't eat, trying to engage him in conversation that slid off his consciousness like water off glass. She'd stopped asking about his investigation, stopped trying to reason with him. Now she just watched him with those sad, frightened eyes, and Daniel knew what she was thinking. He's lost. He's gone somewhere I can't follow. But it was on the 14th day after Marcus's disappearance that everything came apart completely. Sarah had let herself in again, using that spare key he'd never asked her to return. Daniel was at his dining table, surrounded by papers he could no longer make sense of. His laptop opened to search results that seemed to mock him with their mundane explanations. She set a container of soup on the table, homemade, the kind his mother used to make. A peace offering, a lifeline. "Daniel, I need you to listen to me," she said, her voice carrying an edge he'd never heard before. Not anger exactly, but something close to it. Frustration worn so thin it had become sharp. This has to stop. Whatever you think is happening, whatever you think you found, you need to let it go. You're killing yourself. Do you understand that? You're destroying your life over a stranger's paranoid fantasies. He looked up at her, and for the first time in weeks, really saw her. The dark circles under her eyes that matched his own, the tension in her shoulders. The way her hands trembled slightly as she pushed the soup toward him. She was suffering too. He was making her suffer. "What if he was right?" Daniel asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. "What if I let it go and something terrible happens? What if I was supposed to do something, supposed to stop something, and I just gave up?" "Then that's not your responsibility," Sarah said firmly. "Daniel, listen to yourself. You sound like every person who's ever gone down a conspiracy rabbit hole. You sound paranoid, delusional, and I'm terrified that if you keep going like this, you're going to end up hurt or worse." "Or worse," Daniel repeated, and something about those words triggered a memory. Marcus had said something similar that last night, about becoming targets, about people watching. "Sarah, when did you get that bracelet?" She blinked, thrown by the non sequitur. Her hand moved unconsciously to her wrist, touching the thin silver chain with its small pendant. "This? I've had it for months. Why?" "I've never seen it before." "You have, you just don't remember. Daniel, you're not sleeping, you're not eating, your memory is—" "What does the pendant mean?" He stood, moving around the table toward her, watching her expression carefully. "The symbol on it. What is it?" Sarah's face shifted. Something flickered behind her eyes, so quick he almost missed it. Fear, guilt, or was he imagining it, projecting meaning onto innocent confusion? "It's just a design, Daniel. I bought it at a craft fair. It doesn't mean anything." But he'd seen symbols like that in his research, variations on the theme, markers and signs and codes hidden in plain sight. Or was he seeing connections that didn't exist? Was his mind so poisoned by Marcus's suggestions that he was now creating the conspiracy himself, weaving innocent details into a tapestry of paranoia? "Show me your phone," Daniel said suddenly. "What?" "Your phone. Show me your messages. Show me who you've been talking to about me." Sarah took a step back, her expression hardening. "No, I'm not going to let you do this. I'm not going to let you turn me into one of your suspects. I've been your friend for 10 years, Daniel. 10 years, and you're treating me like I'm part of some kind of plot against you." "Then prove you're not," Daniel heard himself say, and the words tasted like ash in his mouth, even as he spoke them. What was he doing? This was Sarah. Sarah, who had never lied to him, never betrayed him, never given him any reason to doubt her loyalty. Except she was here, wasn't she? Coming by every day, watching him, keeping track of his investigation, trying to convince him to give up. What if that wasn't concern? What if it was damage control? "I'm not doing this," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I'm not going to participate in your breakdown. I love you, Daniel. I've loved you for years, even when we were pretending to be just friends, but I can't watch you destroy yourself anymore. Not if you won't let me help you." She turned toward the door, and Daniel felt panic surge through him. If she left, he'd be alone. Truly alone. But if she stayed, could he trust anything she said? Could he trust anyone anymore? "How do I know you're real?" The words came out before he could stop them. "How do I know any of this is real? What if Marcus was right, and everyone around me is part of it? What if I'm already too late to do anything because I've been surrounded by enemies my whole life and never knew it?" Sarah stopped at the door. When she turned back, there were tears streaming down her face. "If you really believe that, Daniel, then you need help. Professional help. Not from friends, not from mysterious strangers, but from doctors who can help you separate reality from delusion." "That's what they'd want me to think," Daniel said, and heard the madness in his own voice. the spiral of logic that ate itself. That's how they'd keep me from finding the truth, convince me I'm crazy, medicate me into compliance. "Goodbye, Daniel," Sarah whispered. And then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a finality that echoed through his empty house. Daniel stood frozen in his living room, listening to her car start, listening to the sound of her driving away, listening to the silence that rushed in to fill the space she'd left behind. And in that silence, he heard the whisper of his own thoughts turning toxic, turning against themselves. What have I done? The question bloomed in his mind like poison. Sarah had been his anchor, his connection to the world that existed before Marcus, before symbols and secrets and apocalyptic revelations. And he'd driven her away because of a bracelet, because of paranoia that had metastasized beyond his control. But what if she really was involved? What if his instincts had been right? The thought and its opposite chased each other through his skull, neither one able to gain dominance, leaving him suspended in a hell of uncertainty. Daniel sank to his knees in the middle of his living room, his hands pressing against his temples as if he could physically hold his fragmenting mind together. The house was so quiet. Had it always been this quiet? Or was the silence new? A symptom of how far he'd fallen, how completely he'd severed himself from normal life. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard laughter in this house. Couldn't remember the last time he'd felt anything other than this gnawing anxiety that ate at him from the inside. When had he last felt safe, happy, human? The darkness outside his windows had deepened, night falling again. Another day lost to obsession and fear. Daniel didn't turn on the lights. What was the point? The darkness outside was the same as the darkness inside, and pretending otherwise seemed exhausting. He crawled to the couch, pulled himself onto it, and lay there staring at the ceiling. The familiar shapes of water stains and texture patterns slowly emerged from the gloom, and Daniel realized he was crying. Silent tears running down his temples into his hair, his body shaking with sobs he couldn't hear. What if Marcus had been a delusion? What if Daniel's mind, starved for meaning and purpose after years of empty routine, had invented the entire thing? The drenched stranger at his door, the secret photographs, the symbols and prophecies. What if it had all been a hallucination, a psychotic break disguised as a hero's journey? But he had the photographs on his phone, the pictures of the symbol in the abandoned church. He pulled his phone from his pocket with shaking hands, pulled up the photo gallery, and his heart stopped. The folder was empty. The pictures he'd taken were gone. All of them. Every photograph, every piece of evidence he'd collected, vanished as if they'd never existed. Had they ever existed? Or had he imagined taking them? Imagined the evidence that would have proven his sanity? Daniel's phone slipped from his nerveless fingers, landing on his chest. The screen cast a cold blue glow across his face, and in that light he could see the truth he'd been running from. He was lost, completely, utterly lost. He'd descended so far into this labyrinth of suspicion and revelation that he could no longer find his way back to reality. Maybe Sarah had been right. Maybe he did need help. But how could he ask for help when he couldn't trust anyone? How could he surrender himself to doctors and therapists when they might be part of the very conspiracy he was trying to expose? The logic was perfect, unbreakable, and it trapped him as effectively as any prison. He thought about his parents, both dead now for years. What would they think of what he'd become? His father, who'd always valued rationality and evidence, who'd taught him to question everything but never to lose himself in the questioning. His mother, who'd always worried he was too isolated, too comfortable with his own company, too willing to retreat into his own head. They'd tried to warn him in their ways, tried to teach him balance. But Daniel had never been good at balance. He'd always been all or nothing, obsessive when something caught his interest, completely indifferent when it didn't, and now that tendency had finally destroyed him. The hours passed unmarked. Daniel lay on his couch, Not quite sleeping, not quite waking, existing in a grey space between consciousness and collapse. His mind wandered through memories, trying to find the moment when everything had gone wrong. Was it when Marcus appeared, or earlier? Had the seeds of this breakdown been planted years ago, dormant, waiting for the right trigger? He thought about his job, now lost, his friends, now alienated, his home, now a prison of his own making, everything he'd built, everything he'd been, crumbling to dust because he'd chosen to believe, or chosen to go mad. He no longer knew which. In the deepest part of the night, somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, when human resilience is at its lowest ebb, Daniel finally admitted the truth to himself. He was broken. Whatever Marcus had been, whether real or imagined, the encounter had shattered something fundamental in Daniel's psyche, and he didn't know how to put it back together. Maybe that had been the point. Maybe Marcus, real or imagined, had been a test. And Daniel had failed by believing too easily, by abandoning reason for the seductive promise of significance. Maybe the real conspiracy was simpler and crueler than anything he'd imagined. Some people just needed to believe they were important, that their lives meant something, and that need made them vulnerable to anyone who promised them a larger story. Daniel had wanted to matter, had wanted his predictable life to be part of something greater, and that want had been his downfall. He pulled a blanket over himself, not for warmth, but for the illusion of security, of boundaries between himself and the darkness. His house creaked and settled around him, the familiar sounds now seeming ominous, laden with potential threat. Every sound could be someone breaking in. Every shadow could be an enemy. Every thought could be planted by forces he couldn't see or understand. This was hell. Not fire and brimstone, but uncertainty, not knowing what was real, not knowing who to trust, not knowing if your own mind was reliable or if it had become your greatest enemy. And the worst part, the part that made Daniel's chest ache with a grief so profound it felt like drowning, was that he'd done this to himself. He'd chosen to open that door. He'd chosen to let Marcus in. He'd chosen to investigate, to obsess, to push away everyone who tried to help him. Every step of his descent had been his own decision, and now he had to live with the consequences, or not live. The thought whispered through his mind, cold and seductive. He could end this. End the uncertainty, the fear, the endless spiral of paranoid logic. It would be easy, quick, final. But even as the thought formed, Daniel felt something stir in him. Not hope, exactly, but something like it. Stubbornness, maybe. Or spite. He'd been broken, yes, shattered. But he was still here, still thinking, still capable of recognizing his own deterioration. And if he could recognize it, maybe he could survive it. The darkness outside his windows was beginning to soften, the first grey hints of dawn bleeding into the night sky. Daniel watched the light grow, minute by minute, pushing back the shadows. It didn't solve anything, didn't answer any of his questions, didn't restore what he'd lost. But it was beautiful. The light was beautiful. And for the first time in weeks, Daniel noticed beauty without filtering it through layers of suspicion and symbolic meaning. It was just light, just dawn, just the world turning as it always had, indifferent to his crisis, continuing despite his collapse. He sat up slowly, his body aching from lying motionless for so long. His house was a disaster. His life was a disaster. But he was still breathing. Still capable of movement, still, somehow, himself beneath all the layers of paranoia and fear. Daniel didn't know what happened next, didn't know if he'd find his way back to sanity or if he'd remain lost in this maze of uncertainty forever. Didn't know if Marcus had been real or if the real conspiracy was the one he'd built in his own mind, brick by brick, suspicion by suspicion. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity as he watched the sun rise over his quiet suburban neighborhood. He couldn't do this alone anymore. Whatever came next, whoever he chose to trust or not trust, he needed help. Real help, human connection, something to anchor him before he drifted so far from shore that he could never find his way back. The thought was terrifying. Asking for help meant admitting he'd been wrong, meant surrendering control, meant trusting that someone, somewhere, could guide him back to solid ground. But staying here in this house, in this darkness, slowly losing himself to paranoia and isolation, was more terrifying still. Daniel stood, his legs unsteady, his vision swimming. But he stood, and standing felt like a victory, small and fragile, but real. He moved to his window, placed his hand against the cool glass, and watched his neighborhood wake up to another ordinary day. Somewhere out there, Sarah was waking up too, hurt by him, frightened for him, maybe already mourning the friendship they'd had. Somewhere out there, life continued. People went to work and came home and lived their simple lives without symbols or prophecies or mysterious strangers at their doors. And Daniel wanted that, wanted it with an intensity that surprised him, wanted the boredom and predictability he'd scorned, wanted the emptiness he'd been so desperate to fill, because he understood now that emptiness was better than this, better than the horror of not knowing what was real. The sun cleared the horizon, flooding his living room with golden light, and in that light, Daniel made himself a promise. He would find his way back, he would ask for help, he would do the hard, humbling work of rebuilding what he'd destroyed, starting with himself. It wouldn't be today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, before he lost himself completely. Before the darkness became permanent, Daniel took a breath, then another, and in the simple act of breathing, of continuing despite everything, he found the first fragile thread that might lead him out of the labyrinth. He wasn't saved, wasn't healed, but he was still here, and that, for now, was enough. Daniel spent 3 days cleaning his house. Not the superficial tidying he'd let slip during his descent, but a deep, methodical excavation of the chaos he'd created. Every paper was examined, sorted, either filed or thrown away. Every surface was cleared, wiped down, restored to order. It was therapeutic in a way, this physical manifestation of trying to reorganize his shattered mind. He was in the basement when he found it. Behind a stack of moving boxes he'd never unpacked from when he first bought the house 7 years ago, wedged between the concrete wall and a cardboard box labeled "Mom's Things" in his own handwriting, there was a leather-bound journal he didn't recognize. Daniel pulled it free, dust cascading off its cover. The leather was old, worn smooth by handling, the kind of journal that had seen years of use. He opened it carefully, half expecting it to fall apart in his hands. The first page was dated 23 years ago. The handwriting was elegant, precise, completely unfamiliar. But the name signed at the bottom of the first entry made Daniel's blood run cold. Thomas Carver, his father's name. But this wasn't his father's handwriting. Daniel had boxes of his father's papers upstairs, letters and notes and shopping lists. He knew his father's script intimately, the way you know the face of someone you've loved and lost. This was different, more controlled, more deliberate, almost like calligraphy. Daniel carried the journal upstairs, his hands trembling. He sat at his dining table, now clear of his conspiracy papers, and began to read by the morning light streaming through his windows. The entries were sparse at first. Observations about daily life, brief notes about work and weather. But as Daniel read deeper, a pattern emerged. His father, or someone using his father's name, had been tracking something. Symbols appearing in unexpected places, conversations overheard that seemed to contain coded meanings, names of people who'd crossed his path in ways that felt orchestrated rather than random. Daniel's father had been investigating a conspiracy. The same conspiracy, or one very similar, to what Marcus had described, and he'd been doing it for years before Daniel was even born. The entries grew more frantic as they progressed. His father had discovered he was being watched, that his investigation had drawn attention from forces he couldn't identify. He'd written about debating whether to stop, to protect his family, or to continue because stopping would accomplish nothing. They already knew. They were already involved. And then, an entry dated 3 months before Daniel's birth. The symbol appeared in the nursery. I painted over it, but I know it will return. I know what this means. My son will be marked from birth. The question is whether I can protect him, guide him, prepare him for what's coming, or whether my involvement will only make things worse. Sarah thinks I'm losing my mind. Maybe I am. But the pattern is too consistent to be coincidence, too deliberate to be paranoia. Sarah. His mother's name had been Sarah. Daniel's hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the journal. His mother had thought his father was losing his mind. The same way Sarah, his friend Sarah, had thought he was losing his mind. History repeating itself, generation to generation, the same story playing out with different actors. He kept reading, page after page, watching his father's investigation deepen and his mental state deteriorate. The handwriting became less controlled, more erratic. Entire entries were nothing but symbols drawn over and over, as if his father had been trying to decode them through sheer repetition. And then, abruptly, the entries stopped. The final entry was dated 6 months before his father's death, the death that had been ruled a heart attack, sudden and unexpected in a man who'd been healthy and active. Daniel had been 17, preparing for college, and his father's death had derailed everything. But now, reading this journal, Daniel wondered if it had really been a heart attack, or if his father had gotten too close to something, discovered something that made him a liability. The final entry was the shortest. They're coming. I've hidden everything I've learned. If I'm right about Daniel, he'll find it when he's ready. If I'm wrong, maybe it's better this way. Maybe some truths are better left buried. I'm sorry, son. I tried to protect you. I hope I succeeded. Daniel closed the journal, his vision blurring with tears. His father had known, had tried to warn him, to prepare him, but in a way that wouldn't expose him too early. The house, Daniel's choice to buy this specific house. It hadn't been chance. His father must have arranged something, left instructions, guided him here without him knowing. And the symbol in the basement, the one Daniel had painted over 7 years ago that hadn't been left by previous owners. It had been left by his father, or by the people who'd marked his father, marking Daniel in turn. Marcus hadn't been the beginning of this. Marcus had been a continuation of something that had been in motion since before Daniel was born. But there was more. Daniel remembered the boxes in the basement, the ones he'd never fully unpacked. Mum's things, he'd labeled them, but he'd never actually gone through them. Too painful after she'd died 2 years after his father. Now, he realized, he'd been avoiding them for a different reason. Some part of him had known there were truths in those boxes he wasn't ready to face. Daniel went back to the basement, pulled out the box labeled with his mother's name, and began sorting through it. Old photos, letters, a jewelry box containing his grandmother's pearls, and at the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, another journal, smaller than his father's, bound in faded blue cloth, his mother's diary. But this one was dated to the year before she died, the year Daniel had been away at college, the year she'd been alone in this house after his father's death. Daniel opened it with dread pooling in his stomach. I found Thomas's journal today, the first entry read. I thought I'd destroyed all of it after he died. I couldn't let Daniel find it, couldn't let him fall into the same obsession that killed his father. But there was one I'd missed, hidden in the basement. I've read it, all of it, and I understand now that Thomas wasn't crazy, or if he was, then so am I, because I see them too. The symbols, the patterns, the way reality bends around certain people and events. He was right, about everything. And now I don't know what to do. The entries continued, documenting his mother's own investigation, her attempts to understand what had claimed her husband's life and threatened to claim her son. She'd been more careful than his father, more methodical. She documented names, dates, connections, building a case that even Daniel, reading it years later with a mind primed for paranoia, found compelling. And then, toward the end, Daniel called today. He's found an apartment near campus. He sounds happy, grounded, normal. Everything I wanted for him. And I've decided I'm going to end this. Not the investigation, but my part in it. I'm going to make sure that whatever Thomas discovered, whatever truth he died protecting Daniel from, stays buried. If they want me to stop, I'll stop. If they want silence, I'll give them silence. Just let my son live a normal life. Let him be free of this. The final entry was dated 3 days before his mother's death. The death that had been ruled an accidental overdose of sleeping pills, tragic but not suspicious. A woman who'd never recovered from her husband's sudden death, finally succumbing to her grief. They came to me with an offer. Stop investigating, burn everything, and Daniel will be protected. He'll live a normal life, unmarked, free. I want to believe them. I want to think that surrendering is the right choice. But I know Thomas wouldn't have. He would have kept fighting, kept seeking the truth, even if it destroyed him. Maybe that's the difference between courage and wisdom. Or maybe it's just the difference between a man who had nothing left to lose and a mother who would sacrifice anything to save her child. I'm making the deal. Tomorrow, I'll destroy everything. And then I'll find a way to make sure Daniel never looks back, even if it means I can't be here to see the life he builds. Forgiveness, my sweet boy, for the choice I'm about to make. The journal fell from Daniel's nerveless hands. His mother hadn't accidentally overdosed. She'd made a choice, had sacrificed herself, had made some kind of bargain to protect him. And it had worked. Daniel had lived a normal life for years, boring, predictable, safe, until Marcus appeared, or until whatever forces his parents had been tracking decided it was time, until the protection his mother had purchased with her life had expired. Daniel sat on his basement floor, surrounded by his parents' secrets, and felt something shift inside him. The paranoia that had been eating him alive for weeks suddenly clarified into something colder, sharper. Anger. His parents had died trying to protect him from this, had given everything to buy him a normal life. And something, had waited just long enough for him to build that life, to become comfortable in it, before shattering it. Marcus hadn't been a warning. He'd been a trigger, a carefully placed explosive designed to detonate Daniel's sanity at precisely the right moment. But why? What was the purpose? If they'd wanted to kill him, they could have. If they'd wanted to recruit him, there were easier ways. Instead, they'd driven him to the edge of madness, isolated him from everyone he cared about, and then abandoned him to spiral. Unless that was the point. Unless the breakdown was the goal. Unless they needed him broken, specifically broken in this way, for some purpose he couldn't yet see. Daniel stood, his jaw clenched with new determination. He gathered both journals, carried them upstairs, and laid them out on his dining table. Next to them, he placed his phone, his laptop, and a notepad. He was going to figure this out, not with the manic desperation of the past weeks, but with cold, methodical precision. His parents had left him a roadmap. He just had to follow it. It took him most of the day to cross-reference his father's observations with his mother's documentation. Names appeared in both journals, dates aligned, symbols his father had sketched, matched symbols his mother had photographed. And slowly a pattern emerged, not of some global conspiracy with clear villains and heroes, but of something more subtle, an organization, or maybe several competing organizations, that monitored people who showed certain characteristics, who asked certain questions, who had certain bloodlines, and they didn't destroy those people. They shaped them, guided them, tested them, and when the tests revealed someone useful, someone malleable, someone who could be broken and rebuilt according to specifications, they were recruited, or eliminated, or in some cases simply driven mad and left as cautionary tales. Daniel realized with growing certainty that Marcus had been genuine, not in the specifics of his claims maybe, but in the fundamentals. There was something real here, something his parents had discovered and died trying to understand. But Marcus had also been part of it, had been sent specifically to test Daniel, to see how he'd react, to see if he'd break the right way. And Daniel had failed, had broken exactly as they'd wanted him to, had driven away his friends, lost his job, isolated himself completely, had become the perfect candidate for whatever they wanted to do with him next. Except now he knew, now he understood the game, and understanding changed everything. Daniel checked the time, 7 in the evening. He picked up his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and found the one he needed. He composed a text message carefully, each word deliberate. I found what my father left me. I know what you are. I know what you want. If you want to finish this, come to my house tonight, 10 o'clock. Come alone, or don't come at all. He sent it to Marcus's number, the one that had been disconnected for weeks, and waited. 10 minutes later, his phone buzzed. A single word, okay. Daniel spent the next 3 hours preparing. He documented everything in his parents' journals with his phone, backed up the files to multiple cloud services. He wrote a letter explaining everything, addressed it to Sarah with instructions that if anything happened to him, she should give it to the police and the press. He left it on his kitchen counter, visible from the doorway. He wasn't suicidal. Wasn't planning to sacrifice himself like his mother had. But he was done being a pawn, done being tested and shaped and driven like an animal into a trap. If they wanted him, they'd have to take him on his terms. At exactly 10 o'clock, there was a knock at his door. Not the desperate pounding of Marcus's first arrival, but a calm, measured rhythm. Professional. Daniel opened it. Marcus stood on his porch, looking nothing like the drenched, desperate man who'd appeared weeks ago. He wore a clean suit, his hair neatly combed, his expression neutral. Behind him, the street was empty, but Daniel didn't for a second believe he was alone. "May I come in?" Marcus asked politely. "You seem to come and go whenever you want," Daniel replied. "Why ask permission now?" Something flickered across Marcus's face. Respect, maybe, or amusement. "Because you've figured it out, because the test is over." So it was a test. Everything is a test, Daniel. Your father knew that. Your mother tried to protect you from knowing that. We were curious which version of understanding you'd arrive at. Daniel stepped back, allowing Marcus to enter. He didn't close the door. Let whoever was watching know that he knew they were there. They stood in his living room 2 feet apart, facing each other like duelists. "My parents died because of you," Daniel said, his voice steady, despite the rage burning in his chest. "My father was killed. My mother was driven to suicide. And you destroyed my life to see if I'd break the same way." "Your father had a heart condition," Marcus said calmly. "Genetic. You have it too, by the way. You should get it checked. Your mother made a choice, but not the one you think. She chose to join us, actually. Chose to be an insider, to protect you from within the organization. But the stress of living double killed her anyway. The pills were an accident of exhaustion, not a sacrifice." Daniel felt the ground shift under his feet. "You're lying." "I'm really not. We lie a lot, but not about this. Not now. Your mother worked for us for 2 years before she died. Some of her journal entries are her documentation. Some are her cover. Can you tell which are which?" Daniel wanted to say yes, but uncertainty crept back in. Had his mother really made that choice? Had she really betrayed his father's investigation to protect her son? "What do you want from me?" Daniel asked, cutting through the doubt. "Why put me through this?" "Because we needed to know if you could survive it," Marcus said simply. "Your bloodline is significant. Your father's research was closer to the truth than most people get. You have his intelligence, his pattern recognition, his obsessive drive, but we needed to know if you also had his weakness, his inability to separate investigation from paranoia, his tendency to self-destruct when confronted with uncomfortable truths." "And your conclusion?" Marcus smiled. "You're here. You're standing. You found your parents' journals, which we left for you to find when the time was right. You figured out the game. You didn't run to the police or the press. You invited me here to confront me directly. You passed, Daniel. Barely, but you passed." "Passed what? What happens now?" "Now you make a choice. The same choice your parents made. Join us. Help us understand and manage the patterns that most people never see, and use that knowledge to protect humanity from threats they can't comprehend. Or walk away, go back to your normal life, and we'll erase all of this. New job, restored friendships, a blank slate. You'll remember it like a bad dream, nothing more." Daniel laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "That's not a choice. That's coercion, wrapped in the illusion of free will." "Welcome to the human condition," Marcus replied. "Every choice is coercion if you examine it closely enough. We're just more honest about it than most." Daniel thought about his parents, about his father, who'd investigated until it killed him, about his mother, who'd tried to bargain, to compromise, to protect her son from having to make this choice. Both approaches had failed. Both had ended in death. Maybe there was a third way. "I'll join you," Daniel said slowly, "on one condition. You tell me the truth, all of it. What you're really protecting people from, what the symbols mean, what my parents discovered that made them so valuable and so dangerous. No more tests, no more games. If I'm going to do this, I do it with full knowledge." Marcus considered this for a long moment. "That's not how we usually work." "Then maybe it's time to change how you work. You want me because I have something my parents had. Pattern recognition, intelligence, the ability to survive what you put me through. But I also have something they didn't. I know what this costs. I know what you take from people. And I'm telling you that if you want me, you take me as I am. Informed, skeptical, willing to walk away if you lied to me." The silence stretched between them. Outside, Daniel heard a car start somewhere down the street, the watchers retreating, maybe, or moving closer. Finally, Marcus extended his hand. "All right, full disclosure, full partnership, but I'm warning you, Daniel. The truth is worse than any conspiracy theory your parents imagined. Worse than what I told you to break you. If you really want to know, you won't be able to unknow it. And there's no reset button for that." Daniel looked at the extended hand. Thought about Sarah, about his lost job, about his parents who died trying to navigate this same impossible choice. Thought about the person he'd been before Marcus appeared, empty and predictable and safe. Thought about the person he was now, scarred and suspicious, and somehow more alive than he'd ever been. He took Marcus's hand. "Show me," Daniel said. "Show me everything." Marcus's grip was firm, and when he smiled, it was the first genuine expression Daniel had seen on his face. "Get your coat. We have a long drive ahead of us. And Daniel, whatever happens next, remember you chose this. No one forced you. That matters more than you know." Daniel grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door, paused to look back at his house one final time. His prison and his sanctuary. The place where his life had ended and begun again. He didn't know if he'd ever return, but he knew he couldn't stay. He followed Marcus out into the night, pulling the door closed behind him. Not locked, just closed, because part of him still believed he might find his way back. that this journey, like his parents before him, might have an end that resembled redemption. But as he walked toward the black car waiting at the curb, toward whatever truth Marcus had promised to reveal, Daniel acknowledged the more likely possibility, that he was walking into the same darkness that had claimed his parents, that this choice, like theirs, would cost him everything. The only difference was that he was making it with his eyes open, his mind clear, and his heart prepared for whatever consequences followed. Marcus opened the car door. Daniel climbed in. The door closed with a solid thunk, sealing him inside, and as the car pulled away from his quiet suburban street, Daniel watched his house disappear in the rearview mirror, shrinking into the distance until it was just another lit window in a row of identical houses where people lived their simple, uncomplicated lives. Lives Daniel would never have again. Lives he was no longer sure he wanted. The truth was waiting, and whatever it cost him, he was finally ready to pay the price. 6 months had passed since Daniel had climbed into that black car with Marcus. 6 months of revelations that had fundamentally altered his understanding of reality, of purpose, of what it meant to be human in a world governed by patterns most people would never perceive. The truth Marcus had promised had been worse than anything Daniel's imagination could have conjured, and better and stranger, and somehow exactly what he'd needed to hear. Now he stood in his garden again, just as he had that evening when Marcus first appeared, his hand wrapped around the same hose, water arcing over the same petunias. But everything was different. He was different. The man who had watered these flowers in mechanical routine, lost in comfortable numbness, no longer existed. In his place stood someone who had been broken and rebuilt, someone who understood that the emptiness he'd felt hadn't been meaningless, but preparation, a hollowing out to make room for what was to come. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reminded Daniel of his mother's favorite scarf, the one she'd worn constantly in the months before her death. He understood now why she'd chosen those colors. They were the colors of transition, of endings that promised beginnings, of sacrifices made in hope rather than despair. The work Marcus had brought him into wasn't what Daniel had expected. There was no shadowy global conspiracy, no Antichrist waiting to emerge, no apocalyptic countdown clock ticking toward humanity's doom. The truth was more mundane and somehow more profound. There were patterns in human behavior, in historical events, in the way societies rose and fell that could be predicted and, to a limited degree, influenced. And there were people, organizations, who had dedicated themselves to understanding those patterns, to nudging humanity toward outcomes that minimize suffering and maximize the chance of survival. It wasn't heroic work. There were no grand battles, no clear victories. Mostly it was research, analysis, the slow accumulation of data that might prevent a war here, avert an economic collapse there, guide a technological innovation toward benefit rather than catastrophe. His parents had been part of it. His mother more successfully than his father, who'd let the pattern recognition become obsession, who'd started seeing conspiracies where there were only probabilities. Daniel had learned to walk the line his father couldn't, to see the patterns without losing himself in them, to understand that just because something could be predicted didn't make it destiny, and just because something was influenced didn't make it controlled. Free will existed, complicated and messy, within systems that were themselves free but bounded by rules too complex for any single mind to fully comprehend. The work was meaningful in a way his old job never had been. He was contributing to something larger than himself, without sacrificing himself to it. He'd found the balance his parents had struggled to achieve. The hose's spray caught the early light, creating a rainbow that hovered in the air for a moment before dissolving. Daniel watched it, appreciating its beauty without needing to find symbolic meaning in it. Sometimes a rainbow was just refracted light. Sometimes beauty didn't need interpretation. He heard footsteps on the sidewalk behind him, recognized the rhythm before he turned. Sarah approached slowly, cautiously, as if she were walking toward a wild animal that might bolt at sudden movement. They'd been rebuilding their friendship carefully over the past 3 months, since Daniel had finally reached out to her with an explanation he could live with and she could accept. Not the full truth, because that would have endangered her, but enough truth to bridge the gap his breakdown had created between them. "You're up early," she said, stopping at the gate, her hand resting on the white picket fence where Marcus's hand had rested that first night. Daniel wondered if she knew, if she could sense the significance of that spot, or if it was just coincidence. "Couldn't sleep," Daniel replied, turning off the hose and setting it aside. "Too much on my mind." "Good thoughts or bad thoughts?" Sarah asked, and Daniel heard the real question beneath the words. "Are you okay? Are you sliding back into that dark place? Can I trust that you're stable?" "Neither," he said honestly. "Just thoughts. About my parents, about choices, about how strange it is that we can go through our whole lives thinking we understand who we are and then discover we were wrong about everything." Sarah opened the gate, stepped into his garden, closing the distance between them in a way she hadn't done in months. She'd kept herself at arm's length since his breakdown, protecting herself from the potential of being hurt again. But something in her expression now suggested that protection might be easing. "You seem better," she said, studying his face with the attention of someone who'd learned to read his moods, who'd catalogued the signs of his deterioration and was now searching for signs of genuine recovery. "Not better like you were before, but better like you found your footing." "I have," Daniel said. "It's different footing than I expected, but it's solid." They stood together in the garden, watching the sun climb higher, the neighborhood beginning to wake around them. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A car engine started, the ordinary sounds of ordinary people beginning ordinary days. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said after a long silence. "That night, when I left, when I said goodbye like I meant it forever, were you really as lost as you seemed, or was there a part of you that was still there, still fighting?" Daniel considered the question carefully. It deserved honesty. "Both. I was lost. Completely lost. But I think I had to be. I think if I hadn't hit that bottom, I never would have found what I was looking for." "And what were you looking for?" "Purpose," Daniel said simply. "Meaning? A reason to believe that my life mattered beyond just filling space and time until I died. I found it, Sarah, not the way I expected, not the way I would have chosen if someone had given me options, but I found it." Sarah nodded slowly, processing this. "And the stranger, Marcus, was he real or was he a symptom?" "Does it matter?" Daniel asked, not deflecting but genuinely curious about how she'd answer. She thought about it. "I guess not. Real or not, he changed you. And you seem okay with who you became." "I am," Daniel said. "More than okay. I'm grateful." The admission surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. But it was true. The pain of those weeks, the terror and isolation and breakdown, had been the price of transformation, and he wouldn't undo it even if he could. The comfortable emptiness of his old life seemed like death now. A slow suffocation he'd been too numb to recognize. "I've been offered a new position," Daniel said, changing the subject gently. "Consulting work, research and analysis. It's flexible, mostly remote, but sometimes I'll need to travel. I wanted you to know, in case you were wondering if I was going to get my life back together." "That's wonderful," Sarah said, and meant it. The relief in her voice was palpable. She'd been worried, Daniel realized, that he'd never recover from his breakdown, that she'd watch him drift further and further from shore until he was lost completely. This was evidence that he was swimming back. What kind of consulting? Risk assessment, pattern analysis, helping organizations understand potential outcomes of complex decisions. All true, as far as it went. The organizations were just more unusual than Sarah would imagine, and the risks were measured in geopolitical stability rather than quarterly profits. "That sounds perfect for you," Sarah said. "Your dad used to do something similar, didn't he? Before he died." "He did," Daniel confirmed, feeling the connection to his father more strongly than he had in years. Understanding now what his father had been trying to accomplish, the weight he'd been carrying. "I think he'd be happy I'm following in his footsteps." "Your mom too," Sarah added. "She always said you had your father's mind. She wanted you to use it for something meaningful." Daniel felt his throat tighten. His mother, who'd sacrificed so much trying to protect him, who'd made choices he was only beginning to understand. She'd wanted him to have a normal life, but she'd also documented the truth in her journals, made sure he'd find it if he was ever ready. She'd tried to give him both options, knowing he'd have to choose for himself eventually. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. "That bracelet you were wearing, the one I asked about, I never apologized for how paranoid I was, for accusing you of being part of some conspiracy." Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her wrist, touching the silver chain that still hung there. "You don't need to apologize. You weren't well. And honestly, looking back, I understand why you were suspicious. I should have been more patient with you." "But what is it?" "The symbol on the pendant. You said it was just a design from a craft fair." Sarah pulled the bracelet off, held it out so he could see the pendant clearly in the morning light. It was a simple, geometric pattern, elegant in its symmetry. Nothing like the complex symbols in his parents' journals. Nothing like the marks that had been left in his basement. "It's called a Celtic knot," Sarah explained. "It represents eternity, continuity, the way everything is connected. I bought it after your dad died, actually. Your mom took me to a little shop downtown, said I should have something to remember him by. We all loved him so much." Daniel took the pendant, examined it closely. Just a Celtic knot. Nothing sinister, nothing coded. His paranoia had taken an innocent object and twisted it into evidence of conspiracy because his mind had been primed to see patterns that weren't there. But the interesting thing, the thing that made Daniel smile despite himself, was that, in a way, he'd been right. Not about Sarah being part of a conspiracy, but about symbols having meaning, about objects carrying significance, about the way patterns connected across time and space. He'd just been looking at the wrong pattern, drawing the wrong conclusions. "It's beautiful," Daniel said, handing it back to her. "I'm glad you have it." Sarah fastened the bracelet back around her wrist, and in her smile, Daniel saw forgiveness. Not just for his accusations during his breakdown, but for all the ways he'd been distant, unavailable, lost in his own head during the years of their friendship. She'd loved him through all of it, waiting for him to become present, to wake up, to be fully alive. "Do you want to get breakfast?" Sarah asked. "There's that new cafe downtown. They have that terrible coffee you like." Daniel laughed, a genuine laugh that felt rusty from disuse but good, like stretching a muscle that had been dormant too long. Terrible coffee is fighting words. "But yes, I'd like that." They walked together out of his garden, leaving the gate open behind them. As they moved down the sidewalk, past houses where families were waking up, where children were being made ready for school, where people were living lives of quiet complexity, Daniel felt a sense of peace he'd never experienced before. Not the peace of ignorance, of not knowing, but the peace of acceptance, of understanding that the world was stranger and more fragile and more resilient than he'd ever imagined, that his role in it was small but not meaningless, that he could contribute without being consumed. They reached Sarah's car and she paused with her hand on the door handle. "Daniel, I'm glad you came back. I'm glad you didn't stay lost." Me too, Daniel said. And Sarah, thank you for not giving up on me. For checking on me even when I pushed you away. For being here now. That's what friends do, she said simply. But in her eyes, Daniel saw something more than friendship, something tentative and hopeful and patient. A door left open, an invitation extended without pressure or expectation. Maybe someday he'd walk through that door. Maybe someday he'd be ready for that kind of vulnerability, that kind of risk. But not yet. He was still finding his balance, still learning who he was in this new life he'd built from the ruins of his breakdown. But the possibility was there, and that was enough. They drove to the cafe together, talking about small things, easy things, the comfortable conversation of people who'd known each other long enough that silence wasn't awkward. Daniel ordered his terrible coffee, Sarah ordered her tea, and they sat by the window watching the city wake up around them. The world continued its endless patterns, its cycles of growth and decay, creation and destruction, meaning and chaos. Somewhere out there, Marcus was probably analyzing data, tracking trends, working to nudge probabilities toward better outcomes. Somewhere out there, others were doing similar work or opposite work, or were completely unaware that such work existed. And Daniel was here, in this moment with this person, drinking mediocre coffee and feeling the warmth of morning sun through the window, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. His phone buzzed once. A message from Marcus. New assignment next week. Details to follow. You did good work on the last project. Your mother would be proud. Daniel read it, felt a complex knot of emotion he didn't try to untangle, and put his phone away. Next week would come with its own challenges, its own patterns to analyze, its own attempts to make the world fractionally better through invisible intervention. But this week, this morning, this moment belonged to him, to healing, to rebuilding, to the slow, patient work of learning to be human in a way he'd never quite managed before his breakdown forced him to start over. Sarah said something funny. Daniel laughed. Outside the window, a child chased a balloon down the sidewalk, joy written across her face in a language that needed no translation. An old man walked his dog, pausing to let it sniff a particular interesting patch of grass. A jogger ran past, earbuds in, lost in their own world of music and motion. Ordinary moments, ordinary people, living ordinary lives that were anything but ordinary, once you looked closely enough to see the complexity, the beauty, the endless, fascinating patterns that emerged when consciousness tried to make sense of existence. Daniel had spent so long looking for extraordinary meaning that he'd missed the extraordinary nature of ordinary meaning. But he saw it now, understood it, appreciated it in a way he never had before. And in that appreciation, in that hard-won wisdom purchased with his breakdown and rebuilt with his recovery, Daniel found something he'd been searching for his entire life without knowing what to call it. He found home, not a place, but a state of being, a sense of belonging to the world, to the patterns, to the vast, incomprehensible dance of existence that included suffering and joy, meaning and meaninglessness, truth and delusion, all woven together into something that transcended any single perspective. His parents had been part of this, had contributed to this, had died as part of this, and now he was too. Not special, not chosen, not the hero of some cosmic drama. Just a person doing work that mattered, finding meaning where he could, connecting with others in the brief span of consciousness that constituted a human life. It was enough. It was everything. It was the only thing that had ever been real. Daniel took another sip of his terrible coffee, smiled at Sarah's story about her nephew's school play, and watched the morning unfold with the patient attention of someone who'd learned that sometimes the greatest mysteries were hidden in plain sight, in the ordinary moments we usually overlooked while searching for significance. He'd found what he was looking for, Finally, not where he expected, not how he imagined, but found nonetheless. And for the first time in his life, Daniel was content to simply be, to exist without needing to prove or achieve or understand everything, to let some questions remain unanswered, to trust that his small contributions to the vast pattern were enough. The sun climbed higher, the cafe filled with more customers. Sarah ordered another tea. Daniel's phone stayed in his pocket, the world's problems waiting patiently for next week. And in that space between his past and his future, in that eternal present moment that was all any of us ever really had, Daniel finally understood what it meant to be alive. Not just surviving, not just enduring, but truly, fully, completely alive. It had taken a stranger at his door, a descent into madness, and a climb back to sanity to teach him. But he'd learned. And that made all of it, every terrifying moment, every loss, every sacrifice worth it.